As President Trump openly encouraged foreign governments to investigate the Bidens this week, new evidence in the House impeachment probe, a batch of text messages released late Thursday night, revealed the Trump administration pressured Ukraine far beyond the president's July phone call with President Zelensky. Peter Baker of the New York Times writes, envoys representing Mr. Trump sought to leverage the power of his office to prod Ukraine into opening investigations that would damage his Democratic opponents at home. And current immersion of the Washington Post reports that a top U.S. official texted, "Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meetings are conditioned on investigations? And I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." These text messages underscored that the president is facing mounting challenges, not only about the whistleblower complaint, but about his use of power in American diplomacy. Joining me tonight, current immersion of the Washington Post, a congressional and national security reporter. Tim Alberta, chief political correspondent for Political Magazine. Susan Page, Washington bureau chief for USA Today. And Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Peter, take us under the hood of what these text messages reveal about President Trump and how he's using his power on Ukraine.
Well, a couple things. One, you get a picture of how much he had outsourced foreign policy in this area to Rudy Giuliani, right? The people who are actually charged with leading our foreign policy in this area, the State Department diplomats, were deferring, in effect, to this non-official, this lawyer for the president, in their dealings with Ukraine as he was trying to pressure them into these investigations. The other thing you learn, I think, is that while the president has said repeatedly, including today, that there was no quid pro quo, there really was, at least in terms of a meeting at the White House, which the Ukraine president really wanted. They made very clear that that meeting was not going to happen without a commitment to fight corruption. By corruption, of course, they meant democratic investigations. And then even one of the diplomats, Bill Taylor, who's based in Ukraine for the United States government, he repeated, as Karen reported, that his suspicion that the aid to Ukraine was also tied in a quid pro quo type of basis. That was denied, but to him, from his position in Kiev, it seemed clear to him that was what was going on.
We're talking about your reporting as well on Capitol Hill all week, staking out the House Intelligence Committee. Were these text messages the smoking gun for House Democrats?
I think Democrats feel like this is the best piece of evidence they've gotten so far in trying to put together this narrative of what was going on here surrounding what we first saw in the whistleblower's complaint, the transcript of the July 25th call between the president, our president, and the Ukrainian president. And now this rounds out even more of that story in terms of what the plans were leading up to that direct interaction and the cleanup afterwards, or the increased demands that were made afterwards of the Ukrainians if they wanted to actually be able to have that fully functional bilateral relationship between the heads of state. Look, you're seeing just as much partisan division, though, as excited the Democrats are about having this documented that makes their case, they believe. Republicans are pointing to the text like the one that came from the U.S. ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, who at the very end of this exchange says there was no quid pro quo here. I think we should take this off the text message chain and just talk on the telephone, and saying, look, that's proof that this was all in the legitimate course of business. It's very striking to see how both parties are approaching this, because the word Biden is never uttered in those text message chains. It's just the discussion about investigating the company for which Hunter Biden worked. We know because of the president's public statements that is basically code for looking at the Bidens in a politically motivated investigation, but it does not say that in the letter, and that's what gives Republicans room to say no quid pro quo here.
Tim, for Republicans, do these text messages cross the line? When you talk to your sources privately, are they alarmed?
Privately, yes. And privately, they have been alarmed by any number of things that the president has said and done for the past couple of years. Bob, I don't think that that's new. And I don't expect there to be much of a break with the president publicly for the same reason that there has not been a break with the president publicly for the last couple of years in any number of these other instances, which is that these Republican elected officials in Washington, they're not hearing from their Republican constituents back in their districts about it.
They're hearing a little bit, perhaps.
Just a little bit. And it typically, it's at the periphery. If they hold a town hall, they'll have a couple of angry comments, maybe from an independent voter here, a Democratic voter there, maybe even a disillusioned Republican once in a while. But by and large, when you talk to congressional Republicans, when you talk to their staff, they're getting almost nothing but overwhelming support for the president back in their red districts. So when they come back to Washington, that's a message for them to hold the line, remain loyal to the president, at least publicly. But yes, privately, they continue to share with anybody who will listen that they are troubled, that they're deeply concerned, that if they had their way, they might even be so bold as to break publicly with the president, but they know that it would probably be career suicide for them.
Susan, you're writing a biography of Speaker Pelosi. What a fascinating figure at this moment in American history. When she steps back and she looks at this new development of the text messages, beyond just the whistleblower complaint, what's her calculus? What's her strategy?
Well, her calculus is that this is a new phase of the Trump presidency. This is different from where we've been before. Contrast it with the Mueller report. The Mueller investigation took 2 years, largely in secret. A confusing story, complicated. We haven't hit the 2-week mark yet on the Ukrainian story, but Republicans now believe, including Speaker Pelosi, I believe, that if they don't get one more document or one more piece of testimony, they have the grounds to impeach President Trump. And I think it is all but inevitable that they will impeach him. And the only question is, how big do they go? Do they try to pursue these new strands that we see with pressuring China and Australia and Great Britain? Can she control the Democratic caucus to not go into all the other things that some of them want to use to impeach President Trump? But I think impeachment is not just on the table now. I think impeachment is now all but guaranteed.
Let's pick up on that point about maybe expanding this probe and this impeachment proceeding. You were at the Capitol today, Karen. You saw the House Democrats are now asking Rudy Giuliani for documents.
Right.
They're asking Secretary of State Pompeo. They're asking Vice President Pence.
Yeah.
Take us inside the House Intel Committee. What's next? What are you looking at?
Well, I mean, it's the House Intel Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Oversight Committee and eventually has to go to Judiciary, right? There is a potentially expanding pool here of people that you can tap. Even if you just look at the whistleblowers complaint, which is what started this whole process off. It says that there's a dozen White House officials that were on that call and various other State Department and Intel officials who were briefed on it. That's a very broad pool. And if each of those people then names somebody else who puts together pieces of this puzzle, because remember, it's not just the one call, it's an entire spectrum of things that occurred before and after, too, that is giving people pause about what's going on here with the president's relationship with Ukraine and what he's trying to get out of the leadership. So it's a very potentially exponential series of investigations that could go all the way further up the chain. But what you've seen happen basically is that they are trying to make sure that they don't lose control of the time element by saying things like Adam Schiff said earlier this week, which was that, well, we're going to consider if people do not comply with our very fast-moving demands for information and threats of subpoenas, then we're going to assume you have something to hide. And we're going to assume that makes our case for obstruction of justice or contributes to it. So this is not your traditional sphere of going back and forth with the White House. It's moving at an incredibly quick clip.
Peter, we saw President Trump in the opening video of this program, defiant as ever. What's your read on the president, not just as a reporter at the White House now, but as a student of the presidency, defying Congress, having exchanges with reporters that are pretty contentious? Right. What's going on inside the West Wing?
Well, I think we saw him as riled up this week as we have seen him in the entire time of his presidency. There have been other times, but this is about as agitated, I think, in public as he has been. Clearly upset about this, clearly combative, clearly defensive, clearly miscalculated the impact that releasing that rough transcript would have. If he honestly thought that was going to exonerate him, it didn't have that impact, obviously. There was no explicit quid pro quo in it, and he thought that was good enough, but the implicit quid pro quo clearly energized Democrats and propelled them on this fast-paced impeachment. Very different than past presidents. Nixon, Clinton, both of them were emotionally distraught and consumed by their impeachment battles, but they didn't show it in public. They tried at least not to show it in public. They thought that was the key to survival. President Trump doesn't hide anything. He doesn't hold back. If he's feeling it, we know it. And I think we saw him very honest, an honest portrayal of how he's feeling this week.
That was only one of the...
so isolated.
Yeah.
That's another way. It's a contrast with the previous presidents we've seen at moments of crisis. There is not a person around him who is saying, don't do that, you can't do that, do this instead. He is his own chief spokesman and chief strategist, and that has served him well. It got him elected to the presidency, but that is a dangerous place to be at this moment.
And even among Republicans, just to Tim's point earlier, you're right, they're not condemning him. I don't see them defending him other than a handful of real hardcore.
That's what feels slightly different about this particular
They're
episode.
hiding. They don't want to have anything to do if they can avoid it.